try to strictly follow putting the best construction on everything. I just Googled him, and he just died 27th of last month.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Well, okay. I'll have to cross out the part where I call him a moron.
Call him a sainted moron if it makes it any better.
Bringing you law, gospel, and guns. This is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competitive shooting, the natural right of self-defense, and what God's Word says about the issues surrounding gun rights and gun ownership. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and you are listening to episode number 157. Thank you so much for making Armed Lutheran Radio a part of your week. We really do appreciate it. Today is our Clinging to God and Guns episode, but Pastor Bennett couldn't be with us. He is dealing with a couple of sick kids and trying not to get sick himself, so he's taking the week off. I hope you'll keep him and his family in your prayers. Speaking of prayers, that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit today. How many of you have heard somebody talk about, making a major life decision and maybe a job change or a career move, a move to a different city, some major family or health decision, and they say, I prayed about it and decided what to do. And you've probably done this yourself. I know I have done this myself. When you think about the 10 Commandments, what do you think? Do you think prayer? Probably not. You think rules and restrictions and laws and things that we're supposed to do or not to do. But Luther encouraged people to actually look at important texts like the 10 Commandments in very different ways. And today we're going to be talking about the 10 Commandments and how to apply those commandments to your life and how they can save you a lot of trouble when big decisions come along, and how considering the 10 Commandments might have changed the outcome of some recent news stories. So got a few stories I'm going to share with you and show you how the 10 Commandments work through that and how praying the 10 Commandments works and how it can affect, or how to use it to affect your decision making. We'll get to that in just a moment, but first I do want to remind you that Armed Lutheran Radio is listener supported. That means that we rely on your support, your financial contributions to make this show happen every week. We're in our 4th year now, and you can be a part of it. Come join our Reformation Gun Club. It's our membership site. For as little as $1 a month, you can be a part of helping continue this Christ-centered pro-gun ministry. We have lots of exclusive content available for members, member discounts, some really cool Armed Lutheran swag. I post new content on the site every week, every Tuesday, and you can check it out yourself and sign up today if you're interested. I hope you will. armedlutheran.us/gun club, or look for a link in the show notes for this episode, armedlutheran.us/157. All right, we're talking about the 10 Commandments. We're talking about how we can pray them, how we can consider them in applying them to the big decisions in our life, and how some people fail to do that and the trouble that can cause. Luther wrote a book on prayer for a man who was his barber, a man named Peter, and he kind of outlined a simple method for praying texts like the 10 Commandments. You'll find that book on Amazon. I'll have a link to it in the show notes. It's called A Simple Way to Pray. It's also found in volume 43 of Luther's works. And here's what Luther wrote about how we should consider the 10 Commandments. I think of each commandment first as instruction, which is really what it's intended to be, and consider what the Lord demands of me so earnestly. Now, this is how most people think of the commandments. This is as far as a lot of people get, but there's more to it. Luther also continues, secondly, we should turn each into a thanksgiving. So we should consider the 10 Commandments and give thanks for those commandments and the way that they protect us and provide for us. The establishment of his church, the establishment and protection of the family, the chastity of our wives and daughters, the establishment of the state and authority, the placing protection around us, in prescribing things like proscribing, not prescribing, things like murder and theft and slander and those sorts of things. Third, Luther says he considers a confession. So in this case, what we're doing is we're taking the commandments, we're thinking about it in terms of how have I sinned against the commandments. And then fourth and finally, we should consider a prayer. We pray to God to help us understand the commandments, to recognize our own shortcomings when it comes to the commandments, and to resist the temptation, the urge, the sinful desire to violate those commandments. And unfortunately, mainstream America, the political left, our media, our celebrities, our politicians, I know that sounded pretty redundant, they've largely rejected Christianity and Christian values, and we see the results of that rejection every day in the news. We say we need to change our laws, we need to restrict the freedoms of law-abiding citizens, we need to take things away, restrict our liberties in order to reduce crime or violence, to protect people. But what we really need is to turn back to God and recognize two things: God's law and our inclination to sin, original sin. We call it the inclination to sin, we call concupiscence. This is the desire, the tendency to actually sin. So let's look at a couple of ways that this plays out in some recent events and how things might have been different if people had considered the Ten Commandments in much the way that same way that Luther considered them 500 years ago. So this first story is from the New York Post. A Florida widow was sentenced to life in prison for plotting with her former lover to kill her husband and high school sweetheart. Denise Williams, age 48, was convicted in December of helping to murder her husband, Mike Williams, who vanished in 2000 while on a hunting trip to Lake Seminole, and I think this is in Florida. Oh yeah, I just read that, Florida. With initial search efforts unsuccessful, investigators presumed that the 31-year-old real estate appraiser had been eaten by alligators. His widow wasn't charged until 17 years later, 2017, after the discovery of her husband's body, which led them to suspect foul play. Denise was accused of having an affair with her husband's best friend, Brian Winchester, and conspiring with him to kill her husband so they could be together. Winchester confessed to authorities in 2017 that he lured Mike to Lake Seminole and shot him in the face. So how do the commandments apply here? I mean, it's pretty obvious how they apply or the ones that were violated, but how could the people in this story have considered the commandments before they made these big life-altering decisions? First, it starts out in the 9th and 10th commandments. We talked about this a few weeks ago on the show with Pastor Bennett about how a lot of the sins that we see, a lot of the crime that we see, most of it actually starts in the two commandments about covetousness, the 9th and 10th commandments. In this case, we're talking about the 10th, and coveting, the desire for, covetousness is the desire for something that's not yours. In this case, it's the desire for these two people who weren't married to be together when one of the two was married to somebody else. So recognizing that sin, confessing it, maybe praying about it, could have prevented this. Recognizing that, hey, there's an attraction here between these two people. There's the possibility that something might happen, that it might turn into something else. Recognizing that, praying about it, repenting of it, asking for God's guidance, that could have averted what ultimately happened. That ultimately led to the violation of the 6th commandment, which is adultery. Again, contemplating the commandments could have avoided this sin. All right, so I've got this desire for someone who's not my spouse. Maybe we should think about this before something happens that we all regret. So let's pray on this. Let's not make any hasty decisions. Let's consider the 10 commandments and determine whether this is something that we ought to do, and clearly it's not. We're all sinners. We all make mistakes. We all, maybe this this couldn't have been avoided somehow. I mean, perhaps one of the two of them, maybe Mrs. Williams, seduced Mr. Winchester, or maybe the other way around. But no matter who started it or where it came from, sex isn't something that just automatically happens. It's not like, oh, hey, look at that. I didn't see that coming. There's a decision point that two people have to make before that happens, right? And there's time there in that moment to make a decision, to contemplate the commandments, to think about, is this something we really need to be doing? And obviously they didn't do that. So the consummation of that covetousness was the adultery, and that led to the desire to remove Mike Williams from the equation so that they could be together. Now, obviously, that's a violation of the fifth commandment, the commandment against murder. Again, here's another decision point. It's not like this is something that just happened overnight. And Mr. Winchester admitted that he lured Mike Williams, his best friend, out on a hunting trip and then shot him. So this was not like, oops, it just happened. Oops, Mike fell in the alligator pit. This was premeditated. And so there was a point at which this was considered and a decision was made. And had Winchester and Mrs. Williams taken a moment to sit down and think about this a little more carefully and prayed about it and considered the 10 commandments, the fifth commandment specifically, maybe a different decision could have been made. Ultimately, though, they sinned against the first commandment. You shall love and trust in God above all things, right? They didn't trust that God had provided for them what they needed. They didn't trust. Mrs. Williams didn't trust that God had provided for her a spouse, the perfect mate. Maybe they weren't perfect. Maybe things were difficult. But God provided that spouse for Mrs. Williams. And the best friend didn't trust God that he had provided for him a good friend. He didn't trust that God had joined Mike and Denise together, and that what God joins together, no man should separate. So they didn't trust that God provides what they need. They decided that they wanted something else. And that's a violation of the first commandment. Now, this next story is a little closer to home for me. This is from the Houston Chronicle. 2 juveniles have been charged in connection with a robbery that left a 16-year-old accomplice dead on Sunday in South Houston, according to police. The deceased teenager has been identified as Sterling Webb, and according to Houston police press release, one 15-year-old male suspect has been referred to Harris County Juvenile Probation Authorities on charges of murder and aggravated robbery. He was arrested on Wednesday at a relative's home, police said. A second juvenile male, also 15, was also referred to juvenile probation on the same charges. That boy remains at large. Police first responded to the shooting at 10:10 p.m. on Sunday night. Responding officers said they found Webb with a gunshot wound in the middle of the street. The preliminary police investigation determined the 3 juveniles, including the deceased victim, had attempted to rob a man. During the attempted robbery, one of the juveniles was shot, and the 23-year-old male victim was assaulted. So what we've got here, and the reason that the juveniles are being charged with murder is because if someone dies, if you are accompanying, at least in Texas, this is the way it works. If you're accompanying someone as they commit it and they're committing a crime, and someone dies in the commission of that crime, even if you didn't pull the trigger, if you were part of the getaway crew or whatever, even if you didn't pull the trigger or stab the guy or whatever, you're guilty of murder. And if one of your accomplices is killed, you're guilty of that person's murder too. So again, if we look at this in terms of the 10 commandments, it starts with the 9th commandment. And again, it's coveting. Coveting is, again, desiring something that is not yours. Like we described it a few episodes back, Pastor Bennett was talking about this. If you have something that I like, and I say, I really like that vacuum cleaner, I like that gun, I like that whatever, that toaster oven that you've got. I want to get one like that. That's not coveting. That's just wanting something that you see you like. Now, if you see that toaster oven on your neighbor's counter and you say, I really want that toaster oven, and you think about ways that you could take it from them, either trick them out of it or steal it, that's coveting. So here, what we have is the desire on the part of these kids to have something that is not theirs, something that was not meant to be theirs, something that belonged to someone else. And so we're talking about covetousness. We're talking about the 9th commandment in this case, because we're not talking about somebody's wife. We're talking about their possessions. So how does this work? Had they been taught the commandments? Had they been catechized by their parents or guardians? They might have considered this sin and avoided what coveting other people's property ultimately led them to, which was attempted theft and a violation of the 7th commandment. That attempt to deprive someone else, your neighbor, of their possessions. We should fear and love God that we may not take our neighbor's money or property, nor get them by false wear or dealing, but help him to improve and protect his property. So they violated the 7th commandment when they went out and they attempted to rob this 23-year-old man. Now, in their attempt to break the 7th commandment, they committed assault, violating the 5th commandment. Now, we talked about the 5th commandment earlier in the earlier article. It's not just about murder. The commandments aren't just a bunch of kind of explicit, you shall not commands, don't do this, don't do that. But they should be interpreted more broadly so that not only is there an expectation that you don't harm your neighbor, but you should protect him, you should befriend him. Not only should you not kill him, but you shouldn't harm him either. So beating up your neighbor is the same violation of the 5th commandment as murdering your neighbor. It would appear that in this case, that the intended victim, the 23-year-old, fought back after he was assaulted and then fatally wounded one of the suspects. Now, this is a killing. And again, the 5th commandment is a prohibition against murder, not a prohibition against killing. So the interpretation of the 5th commandment as thou shalt not kill is incorrect. It's actually thou shalt not murder. In this case, the 23-year-old, who it seems like from the story must have shot one of these teenagers, was defending himself. This is also kind of an illustration of one of the lines that anti-gunners like to use from Matthew 26:52, where Jesus tells Peter to put his sword away because all who take the sword or take up the sword will die by the sword. Well, this right here, this story is what Jesus was talking about, that the consequence of your violent actions may be your death. If you go around assaulting people in order to rob them, it's likely that you're going to meet a swift and untimely demise. It's not unreasonable to expect that somebody's going to fight back, and that fighting back might result in your dying. So that's something to consider, though not exactly the commandments, but it's something that came to mind. There's also the 4th commandment here. I don't know what the parental situation is, but Luther's explanation of the 4th commandment, we should fear and love God that we may not despise or anger our parents and masters, but give them honor, serve, obey, and hold them in love and esteem. So honoring your father and your mother, assuming these kids had a father and a mother, but whoever was their guardian, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, do you think they were being honored and obeyed by going out and trying to rob people at night? I seriously doubt it, unless, of course, you got a really screwed up family that's telling you to go out, that it's okay to go out and rob people, then you're probably not honoring your parents by committing acts of violence and trying to rob people. And finally, as with all violations of the commandments, these are ultimately violations of the 1st commandment, that lack of love and trust in God, who promises to provide for you all the things that you need. If you desire to go out and steal from people, obviously you're not trusting in God that He's going to provide for you. So this last story is also from Houston, and this is an interesting story. And this you might have heard about in the news, the story about the shooting of 5 Houston police officers during a narcotics raid. Well, there's a bigger story here, and it's quite interesting. Characterizing gun violence as, quote, one of the greatest public health epidemics facing the nation, Houston Police Chief Art Acevedo pressed Congress on Wednesday, this was last Wednesday, to pass a red flag law and tighten background check requirements this year, adding that saving one life is enough to justify new restrictions. I'm not going to address the stupidity of that statement. There are other things, because there's not a commandment against being stupid. So you can be dumb all you want and not violate any of the commandments. Amid what he referred to as, quote, almost regular mass shootings in the United States, Acevedo asked lawmakers to use common sense to balance Second Amendment protections while addressing gun violence. He then implored lawmakers to, quote, act now to require universal background checks, expand mental health services, and to pass red flag provisions to temporarily take guns from people deemed by a judge to present a danger to themselves and others. Acevedo's appearance before the U.S. House Judiciary Committee was just last week after 5 Houston police officers were shot and injured during a drug raid. Now, we'll talk more about that raid here in just a moment. But first, let's consider what we've got going on here. We've got a public official, the police chief of Houston, calling on Congress to move to restrict the rights of citizens in an effort to reduce gun violence, quote unquote. Now, he's entitled to his opinions about gun violence. Like I said, he's entitled to be stupid, misinformed. He's not entitled to his own facts, though. Acevedo went on to say this: doing nothing is not acceptable. Our sons, our daughters, our children, our family members, our police officers are being shot, killed, and maimed, and I would urge Congress to do something this term. It's our time to make a difference because our streets, our neighborhoods are truly drowning in the blood of our victims and the tears of their loved ones. But see, here's the problem. What he fails to recognize and address is the root cause of violence, namely sin. And that leads the godless left to push for more gun control, illogical laws that won't have any effect on the violence that they're so upset about. 15 to 20 years ago, we had a problem with drunk driving, and there was it was the big hot topic that everybody was worried about. What are we going to do to reduce drunk driving deaths? And there was a public safety campaign to reduce drunk driving deaths, and those deaths have declined over the years. How did we do that? Did we do that by making it harder for people to use recreational drugs or to drink alcohol? No, because blue laws have been repealed and rolled up, and in some states you've got the legalization of recreational drug use. So how did we do it? How did we reduce the deaths caused by drunk drivers? Did we make it harder for people who don't drink to buy a car? No. So why are we approaching gun violence with that mentality? Instead of doing something about the criminals and trying to address the underlying issues, we're scapegoating people who want to keep their guns for protection and lawful purposes and who are not going out and causing problems. Now, let's talk about that raid. This was where 5 Houston narcotics officers were shot during a drug raid. Now, do you know anything about this? Have you read anything about it? Officers launched a no-knock search warrant raid on a house in South Houston based on, get this, an anonymous tip and the word of a confidential informant who said that he had bought drugs from the occupants of that home, specifically black tar heroin. So what happened here? They launched a raid, a no-knock raid, which means they come to the house, they don't knock and say, hey, police, we have a warrant. They come to your house and kick your freaking door in with guns drawn. Again, not based on surveillance, not based on any undercover operation, based on the tip of a confidential informant. So based on this uncorroborated info, 5 plainclothes narcotics officers kicked in the door at 5 in the afternoon. Now, we don't know exactly because we're having to take the word of the police because there's no body cam footage. How convenient. And anyway, what happened was they kicked in the door and they ended up in a shootout with the homeowner The 5 officers were wounded, 2 of them critically. They all have survived, but the homeowner and his wife were killed. Now, people were clearly critical of this raid and this tactic. And Joe Gamaldi, who is the president of the Houston Police Officers Union, held a press conference where he said, "We are sick and tired of having targets on our back. We're sick and tired of having dirtbags trying to take our lives when all we're trying to do is protect this community and protect our families. Enough is enough." And then he went a step further, and he suggested that the police are going to be keeping track of people who are critical of police actions. Well, Chief Acevedo didn't really like that, thought he went a little too far and kind of disavowed that statement, said that he misspoke, but he then went on to say that more needs to be done to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. So, and he, of course, called for the standard litany of solutions: background checks, a reinstatement of the assault weapons ban, and magazine capacity bans. So who were these dirtbags? Their names are Dennis Tuttle and Regina Nicholas. They lived in that house for 20 years. They had no criminal record. Tuttle was a former Marine who was disabled and honorably discharged, and Regina was a cancer survivor. Like I said, there's no body cam video. The police were in plain clothes. It's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Based on a tip from a confidential informant and not based on their own surveillance, they show up with 5 officers and kick in the door with guns drawn. According to the police, they shot one of the couple's dogs with a shotgun. Tuttle then returned fire, striking one of the officers. Regina Nicholas then attempted to disarm this wounded intruder, and other officers opened fire on her and killed her. Tuttle then returned fire, striking several other officers. They shot and killed him. Guess what they found in that house? A revolver and 2 shotguns. Not a speck of black tar heroin, or any other drug for that matter. Neighbors described the couple as good people, wonderful friends. One woman said she and Regina were really close. They talked together. They spoke to each other almost every day because they were both going through cancer treatment at the same time. Doesn't sound like dirtbags to me. So the police mounted a no-knock raid based on the word of a criminal, probably. That's typically what confidential informants are. They stormed into the couple's house, they shot their dog, and when the homeowners returned fire, they killed them. And when they found nothing to substantiate the claims of the confidential informant, they then referred to the homeowners as dirtbags and people who shouldn't have guns. And the police chief used this raid in his testimony before Congress in an attempt to push gun control. Gun control that would have had absolutely no effect on the outcome of that raid because Tuttle wasn't a criminal. Regina wasn't a criminal. They weren't in possession of any drugs. Do you think anybody's going to pay for this? Think any heads are going to roll? The cops, the chief, the confidential informant? Probably not. Do you think this could happen again? You bet your butt it would. Because as long as the law allows that tactic to be used based on the flimsiest of evidence, any of us can be targeted by somebody who's got a grudge. So what do the commandments have to do with this? Well, if it turns out, based on what we know now, a week out, we still haven't found any evidence that they're criminals. If it turns out, though, that Tuttle and Nicholas were, in fact, completely innocent, we got a 5th commandment issue to consider. If this raid was launched based on faulty information, then the couple were actually murdered by the state. It doesn't matter if they fired back at people they thought were home invaders. Home invasion is not uncommon in Houston. It's not exactly the safest city on the planet. The policy of no-knock search warrants based on flimsy evidence needs to be reconsidered in light of the 5th and the 8th commandments. Pure and simple. It's possible that the information from the anonymous source and a career criminal confidential informant might be false. I know that may come as a surprise to you that criminals don't always tell the truth and that people have agendas. It's possible that they were violating the 8th commandment, bearing false witness against Mr. Tuttle and Miss Nicholas. We should fear and love God that we may not deceitfully belie, betray, slander, or defame our neighbor, but defend him, think and speak well of him, and put the best construction on everything. that applies to the government as well. The police have a responsibility to put everything in the best put the best construction on everything, to consider the evidence more carefully when they receive it from suspect sources. They need to work harder to corroborate the reports that they receive before they mount an armed raid that might result in someone's death. The fifth commandment there applies in two different ways. One, if the informant essentially swatted this couple, intended to inform the police so that they would be raided or arrested, he's as guilty of their deaths as the officers who pulled the trigger. And in this case, it was a violent assault against people who were alleged to have been doing nothing but sell drugs. Now, I'm not a fan of drugs, and I'm not suggesting that you do them. I think people who use drugs or smoke pot are losers, but it's up to you. And our law enforcement officers and our lawmakers maybe need to reconsider no-knock raid policies in light of the fifth commandment. The idea that you should use a no-knock raid with the potential of violence and the potential of injury and death against nonviolent suspects. In the end, you're arresting an alleged drug dealer. Is it worth the lives of the officers who go in on the raid? Is it worth the lives of the civilians, even if they are drug dealers or even if they're drug users? It's not worth killing them. And it's certainly not worth the risk of killing a civilian if you make a mess of the raid. And that brings up a fourth commandment issue surrounding the police and their responsibility to serve and protect the citizens. I talked about this earlier. Romans 13, God grants government the power to bear the sword on our behalf, to bring the wicked to justice. But that power needs to be used with more discernment and wisdom. And two final points on this. The eighth commandment comes into play again with the president of the police union who referred to the victims as dirtbags and who threatened to surveil anybody who dared to criticize the cops. Maybe the police union should hold their tongue and wait for more facts. I mean, we always talk about citizens whenever there's a police shooting, and the citizens, the media and comments of the everyday citizen is quick to judge the police before they know the facts. That requirement to wait until you know more applies to police just as much as it applies to us as citizens. So they need to hold their tongue before they go out slandering people killed by police in a botched raid. And then there's Chief Acevedo, who used this tragedy to push gun control. He's been playing on our emotions, using hyperbole, suggesting that anyone who opposes gun control or limiting anybody who doesn't want to limit the liberties of law-abiding gun owners, law-abiding citizens, that if you oppose that, you're responsible for blood in the streets and the tears of the families of the victims. It's despicable. It's a violation of the eighth commandment to ascribe selfish or evil motives to somebody who thinks maybe there's a different way to approach this and to solve the problem of violence. Ultimately, the chief's comments stem from, I think, a replacement of God with the power of government and the coveting of political power. So what we're talking about here with all gun control is not about guns, it's about control. And a violation of the ninth commandment, a coveting of power that wasn't ascribed to you, that God didn't grant you, a power over the citizens that can only be seized if the citizens are unarmed. So that's the way, that's a little insight into how to consider the 10 commandments. When you're making big decisions like, should I kill this person or not? Maybe sit down and pray the 10 commandments. If you're going to launch a violent raid on people based on flimsy evidence, maybe you should consider the 10 commandments before making that decision and sending your police officers into harm's way. So just a few things to think about how you can apply the 10 commandments in your own life when you're making big decisions, hopefully less consequential than having extramarital affairs or killing people. But let us know if you have any comments or questions about this episode. Visit our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback. Leave us a voicemail or a voice message or send us an email. We'd love to hear from you and respond to your questions in a future episode. And tune in again next week for another of our variety shows. Pastor Bennett will be here with his Pastoral Pontifications segment. Sergeant Bill will be here with another Ballistic Minute tip. and Mia will have more of her motivations. So until then, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. Check out the Facebook page, The Armed Lutheran, or join our Facebook group, Fans of Armed Lutheran Radio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a comment on our feedback page at armedlutheran.us/feedback, or a review on iTunes, and let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to Armed Lutheran Radio.